Welcome, history buffs and adventurers, to a story that has captivated imaginations for over a century and a half. The ill-fated Franklin expedition. In 1845, Sir John Franklin, a seasoned Arctic explorer, set sail from England with two of the most advanced ships of their time, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. Their mission? To discover the elusive Northwest Passage, a sea route that promised to unlock new trade routes and cement Britain's naval dominance. But what began with the cheers of a nation would descend into one of history's most harrowing and mysterious tragedies. Join us as we journey into the ice, following the footsteps of these brave and ultimately doomed men. The HMS Erebus and HMS Terror were not built for speed, but for brute strength. These were bomb ships, their hulls heavily reinforced with iron plates and multiple layers of oak, designed to withstand the crushing embrace of Arctic ice. From the outside, they projected an image of squat, powerful determination. Yet inside, a stark contrast existed. The officers' quarters were a glimpse of Victorian luxury, polished mahogany, gleaming brass, a library of books, fine china. But this veneer of civilization was thin. Below decks, the crew was crammed into tight, dark, damp spaces, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, tar, and bilge water. As the expedition wore on, both ships became extensions of the men's suffering. Frost coating the interior walls, the wood groaning under the ice's pressure, the once polished brass turning dull and tarnished. Ultimately, they would transform from symbols of imperial might into frozen, floating tombs. Leading this grand endeavor was Sir John Franklin, captain of HMS Erebus. In his late 50s, a veteran of Trafalgar and previous Arctic journeys, he carried the weight of authority and a deep, unshakable Christian faith. Franklin was kind, paternal, but also stubbornly optimistic. His public face was one of calm confidence, masking private flickers of doubt and immense pressure to succeed for Britain's glory. He was, in essence, the expedition's hubris personified. In stark contrast was Francis Crozier, captain of HMS Terror. An Irishman in his late 40s, Crozier was the true Arctic expert of the expedition, having served with Parry and Ross. He was pragmatic, quiet, and observant, with a melancholy air about him. He lacked Franklin's easy charm, but possessed a deep understanding of the ice and its dangers. He was the story's realist, his warnings often subtly dismissed by the more optimistic English officers. He was the tragic heart of the story. Others rounded out the crew. James Fitzjames, a charismatic and ambitious officer in his 30s, the golden boy of the Royal Navy. He was handsome, well-spoken, and universally liked. Initially, he was the epitome of naval excellence, but his lack of true Arctic experience made him dangerously overconfident. His journey was one of seeing his polished world crumble into brutal reality. Dr. Harry Goodseer, a young, curious, and empathetic Scottish scientist. He was our window into the human and scientific toll of the expedition. He was fascinated by the new world, but horrified by the suffering he must witness and treat. He meticulously documented everything, from Arctic flora to the gruesome symptoms of scurvy and lead poisoning, until he could no longer hold a pen. Thomas Blanky, a veteran sailor, tough and practical. His face was a map of wrinkles from years of squinting at ice floes. He spoke plainly and understood the ice as a living, breathing entity. He was loyal to Crozier and deeply mistrustful of the officer's textbook knowledge. And Cornelius Hickey, a cunning, wiry man with watchful eyes. He represented the breakdown of lower deck discipline. He was a survivor, Utterly selfish and manipulative, skilled at turning men's fear and desperation to his own advantage. He was the human monster born from the disaster. The expedition began with immense fanfare at Greenhithe Docks, England. The two massive ships, Erebus and Terror, were a hive of activity, with banners flying and crowds cheering, creating a powerful sense of national pride and excitement. Franklin, in his cabin on the Erebus, had a quiet moment of reflection, looking at a portrait of his wife, Lady Jane. Crozier, ever the professional, oversaw the final loading of supplies on the Terror. He shared a knowing, skeptical glance with his ice master, Blanky. Wives and children waved tearful goodbyes at the docks, and young sailors full of bravado promised to return as heroes. The air was thick with hope and poignant farewells. Franklin gave a rousing speech over a fine meal in the officers' mess on the Erebus. He toasted to the discovery of the Northwest Passage. Commander Fitzjames beamed with confidence. Crozier barely touched his wine. The magnificent ship sailed out into the English Channel, a cinematic wide shot showing the pride of the Royal Navy. Below deck on the Terror, sailors sang shanties, drank their rum ration, and gambled. The atmosphere was loud and boisterous. Hickey watched from a corner, assessing everyone. In Dr. Goodseer's cabin on the Erebus, Goodseer carefully labeled jars of specimens collected from the coast of Scotland. He wrote in his journal, full of scientific optimism. In the North Atlantic, the first storm hit, violent and chaotic. Men struggled with ropes and sails, soaked to the bone, in their first test. In Crozier's cabin on the Terror, Crozier studied charts of the Arctic and made a small, pessimistic note in the margin that no one else would see. Whalefish Islands, Greenland, was their last stop, where fresh meat was brought aboard from supply ships. The men were in high spirits, enjoying the solid ground. On the Greenland shore, Dr. Goodseer excitedly sketched a rare Arctic flower, his face alight with the joy of discovery. Below deck on the Erebus, a young sailor wrote a letter home, full of wonder about the icebergs and the strange new world. Franklin preached a Sunday service on the deck at Whalefish Islands, speaking of God's providence and their glorious Christian mission. In Baffin Bay, the ships encountered their first massive icebergs, creating a sense of awe and wonder among the crew. Fitzjames remarked on their terrible beauty. In the Crone's Nest on the Terror, a lookout, his face raw from the wind, shouted down, "Ice ahead! Thick pock!" On an ice floe, the steam engine was engaged for the first time, and the ship's iron-reinforced bow crunched through the thinner ice, a display of power. In the galley, the cook opened a can of preserved meat with a close-up on the lead solder seam along the can's edge, an ominous detail. Lancaster Sound, the gateway to the passage, was clear. Franklin felt vindicated, and it seemed their path was open. On the deck of the Erebus at night, the aurora borealis appeared for the first time. The entire crew, from officers to sailors, stared up in silent, shared wonder, in a moment of pure, transcendent beauty. The initial optimism was soon challenged. The ships found a perfectly sheltered harbor at Beechy Island to wait out the first winter. A sense of relief and accomplishment pervaded, feeling that they were making good progress. In the officers' mess on the Erebus at night, they celebrated a successful season. Plays were staged, songs were sung. The mood was confident, almost arrogant, and the veneer of Victorian England held strong against the cold. On Beechy Island, men built an observatory, a forge, and workshops on the shore. They were industrious, keeping busy to fight the encroaching cold and boredom. But then, the first crack in their armor appeared, the first death. A young Marine died of what was diagnosed as pneumonia. A formal funeral was held, with men standing in the bitter cold, their breath misting. Dr. Goodseer performed an autopsy in his cabin at night, his face grim. He noted the man's lungs were in a terrible state, but also made a private note about the man's poor general health. 2 more graves were dug in the frozen ground before the winter was over. The sight of the 3 simple wooden headstones became a constant, grim reminder of their mortality. In Crozier's cabin at night, Crozier noted the men's slowly declining health and morale in his private log. He suspected the canned food was not as wholesome as promised, but had no proof. Spring brought temporary relief as the ice finally broke in the Arctic and the ships were freed. A loud, genuine cheer went up from the men. Hope was renewed and the deaths of the winter felt like a necessary sacrifice. However, Franklin made a fateful decision in Peel Sound, choosing to sail south down a channel that looked clear against Crozier's hesitant, subtly worded advice to take a more northerly proven route. Fitzjames backed Franklin enthusiastically. As they pushed deeper south into Victoria Strait, the ice began to thicken around them, much faster than expected. The open channel was a mirage. The lookout's face in the crow's nest was etched with worry. He shouted down, his voice strained, "Ice, sir! All around! No way through!" On the pack ice, a terrifying sound emerged. The ice groaned and screeched as it closed in, a sound like tearing metal and grinding stone. The massive ships were halted, trapped like flies in amber. On the deck of the Erebus, Franklin stared at the endless white expanse, his confident expression finally faltering. Fitzjames tried to reassure him. "The spring thaw will free us, sir." Crozier, on the Terror, knew better. Below deck, the men were quiet, anxious. They lay in their hammocks, listening to the constant, unnerving sound of the ice grinding against the hull. A hunting party was sent out onto the pack ice. They traveled for miles across the treacherous ice and returned with only 1 skinny Arctic hare. It was not enough. In the sick bay on the Erebus, Dr. Goodseer examined a sailor's gums, which were swollen, purple, and bleeding. He looked up with dread. It was the first clear, undeniable case of scurvy. In Crozier's cabin on the Terror at night, Crozier wrote a blunt, professional report for Franklin, detailing the ice's thickness, the direction of its drift, and the dwindling hope of a thaw before the next winter. In Franklin's cabin on the Erebus at night, Franklin read Crozier's report, his hands trembling slightly. He put on a brave face for Fitzjames, ordering double rum rations to keep up the men's morale. A montage of scenes on the pack ice showed the passage of time. The sun got lower on the horizon. The men's faces got thinner and paler. The pristine white snow around the ships became stained with soot, waste, and the blood from butchered seals. The slow decay had begun. On the deck of the Terror at dusk, a pressure ridge built with terrifying speed, a mountain of ice rising from the flat plain. It groaned towards the Terror. Men on deck scattered in panic. The ship creaked, tilted violently, its timbers screaming, but miraculously it held. A near disaster that left everyone shaken. The sun disappeared below the horizon for the second, endless winter. A palpable wave of despair washed over the skeletal men watching from the deck. This was a darkness of the soul as much as the sky. The sick bay on the Erebus was now overflowing. Men groaned in their hammocks, their bodies twisted by scurvy. Dr. Goodseer was gaunt and exhausted, his precious supplies of medicine almost gone. The air was thick with the smell of sickness and death. In the galley, the cook scraped the last moldy bits from a barrel of flour. The rations now were starvation level. The once vaunted tinned provisions were a source of poison and disappointment. In the flickering candlelight below deck on the Terror, Cornelius Hickey quietly talked to a few desperate, angry men. He blamed the officers' incompetence, preying on their fear and hunger. He was planting the seeds of mutiny. On the pack ice, a sailor, driven mad by the darkness, isolation, and pain, suddenly began screaming. He broke from the others and ran from the ship, laughing maniacally into the white emptiness, never to be seen again. No one had the strength to chase him. Sir John Franklin, in his cabin on the Erebus, was now visibly ill, confined to his bunk, but still held meetings. His voice was a weak rasp. He refused to show weakness, clinging to the tatters of his authority. In Crozier's cabin on the Terror, Crozier and his ice master Blanky looked at the charts. They both knew the ships would never be free. "We'll have to walk out, south, for the river," Blanky said grimly. Crozier nodded, the terrible weight of the decision settling on him. In a pathetic attempt at normalcy, a broken Fitzjames tried to stage another play in the officers' mess on the Erebus. The performance was grotesque. The men were too sick and weak to act properly or laugh. The farce highlighted their horrific reality. In Dr. Goodseer's cabin, Dr. Goodseer examined his own gums in a small cracked mirror. They were swollen and bleeding. He calmly opened his journal and, with a trembling hand, noted the symptom. Sir John Franklin died on the deck of the Erebus. His body, wrapped in a Union Jack, was carried from his cabin. The remaining men, gaunt and freezing, watched in stunned, hollow-eyed silence. Their leader, their symbol of the expedition's hope, was gone. In Franklin's cabin, Crozier and Fitzjames stood over Franklin's empty desk. Crozier was now in command of a dead and dying expedition. The weight of over 100 doomed men fell squarely on his shoulders. A burial at sea took place on the pack ice, where a large hole was cut in the ice. Franklin's body was committed to the deep. Crozier's eulogy was short, bleak, and pragmatic. There was no pomp, only freezing finality. Below deck, more men were dying. The ship was becoming a floating morgue. The sounds were of quiet weeping and the harsh, rattling coughs of men whose lungs were failing. Under Crozier's orders, the able-bodied men began the torturous work of emptying the ships and packing heavy sledges. They were weak and the work was agonizing. They were preparing to abandon their vessels. In Crozier's cabin on the Terror, Crozier dipped a pen in ink and wrote the final official record, the famous Victory Point Note. He detailed Franklin's death, the number of dead, and their desperate plan to march south for the back river. He sealed it in a metal cylinder. In the officers' quarters on the Erebus, Fitzjames, his golden boy persona completely shattered, smashed a bottle of fine brandy against a wall in a silent fit of rage and despair. He was a broken man. On the pack ice, the men saw their first Inuit hunters at a distance. The strange, fur-clad figures watched them silently from a ridge before disappearing like ghosts. A glimmer of other human life, but also a source of fear and uncertainty. In Dr. Goodseer's cabin, Dr. Goodseer was now skeletal. He looked at his beautiful, precise scientific drawings, relics of a hopeful past, and wept quietly, mourning not just his own life, but the death of knowledge and reason. On the final day at the ships, the remaining men, about 100 souls, ragged and emaciated, assembled on the ice. They took a last look back at the two great ships, their frozen homes, now their tombs in the ice. The march began on the pack ice, a long, straggling line of scarecrow figures hauling impossibly heavy sledges filled with useless Victorian relics like silver cutlery, heavy books, and a writing desk. It was a funeral procession for an entire expedition. The landscape of King William Island was a flat, featureless, and soul-crushing hell of rock and patchy snow. The wind was relentless, cutting through their ragged clothing. There was no shelter, no landmark, only a white horizon. The first man collapsed during the march. He could not get up. The others looked to Crozier, who knew they cannot carry him. Crozier knelt, said a brief prayer, left him a piece of biscuit, and ordered the others to move on. They left him behind to die alone in the snow. In the dim, flickering light of a fire made from a broken sledge, at a campsite, another man died. The survivors were too exhausted to do anything but sleep. In the morning, they discovered that some of the flesh has been carved from his frozen limbs. The ultimate taboo had been broken. Hickey looked on, his expression unreadable as others react with horror and nausea. Crozier, his face like a granite mask of fury and grief, confronted Hickey about the cannibalism during the march. Hickey and his small group of followers, the strongest of the survivors, stared back, their eyes fierily defiant. The chain of command was completely broken. Commander Fitzjames, delirious from scurvy and starvation, stumbled and fell during the march. Crozier rushed to his side. Fitzjames, in a moment of clarity, apologized for his earlier arrogance and hubris. He died in Crozier's arms. At the campsite, the group had now split. Crozier led a small band of the sickest and most loyal men. Hickey led a larger group of the more ruthless survivors. They camped apart, watching each other with suspicion and fear. A pack of starving Arctic wolves drawn by the scent of death and sickness circled Crozier's pathetic camp. The men were too weak to fight them off effectively. A seam of pure primal fear as the shadows darted just beyond their small fire. At the coastline, they finally saw open water. A brief, hoarse cheer went up, a momentary surge of elation. It was quickly crushed when they realized they had no seaworthy boat and no way to cross the frigid channel to the mainland. It was another dead end. A small group of survivors, including the barely conscious Dr. Goodsire, stumbled towards an Inuit camp they spotted from a ridge. The Inuit were frightened by the appearance of these walking skeletons. They offered them some seal meat, but kept their distance, wary of the sickness and madness in their eyes. Inside an Inuit tent, Dr. Goodsire, lying on a skin and clearly dying, used his last ounce of strength to trade a shiny naval button for another piece of meat. He observed the Inuit family with scientific curiosity, even as his life faded, his mind clinging to its purpose until the very end. Crozier was now barely able to walk, supported by his last loyal sailor during the march. He was hallucinating, seeing visions of his home in Banbridge, Ireland, the green fields a stark contrast to the white hell around him. Hickey's group turned on one of their own who had become too weak to keep up. They murdered him for food. The descent into absolute savagery was complete. There was no morality left, only survival. Crozier and his last handful of men reached the mouth of the Back River, their goal. But it was too late. They were too weak to go further. They huddled together behind a low rock wall, out of the wind, waiting for the end. A lone survivor, his mind completely gone, wandered aimlessly across the tundra on King William Island. He clutched a single, water-stained book from the ship's library, its pages flapping uselessly in the wind. Starvation Cove was the final resting place of what was likely Crozier's last group, a desolate beach littered with skeletons and pathetic relics, a single boot, a broken clay pipe, a tattered piece of a wool uniform, all half buried in the sand. A close-up shot on a human femur bone revealed tiny, unmistakable parallel lines, the knife marks of defleshing, the grim, silent evidence of cannibalism. A single dying man, implied to be Crozier, lay on his back on King William Island, looking up at the vast, empty sky. he saw a raven circling high above. He closed his eyes. The sound of the wind was all that remained. An aerial shot of the landscape showed a slow, majestic pullback from the last survivor to reveal the immense, indifferent, and empty Arctic landscape that consumed them all, a silent, white world. The tragedy, however, did not end in the Arctic. In 1850, Lady Jane Franklin, dressed in black but full of fire, passionately pleaded with the stone-faced naval lords at the Admiralty in London to fund another search party. They were polite but dismissive, viewing the cause as lost and too expensive. In 1854, a different kind of expedition, led by Dr. John Ray of the Hudson Bays Company, traveling light with dog sleds and living off the land, met a group of Inuit hunters in the Arctic. He was practical, experienced, and respected their knowledge. Inside an Inuit igloo at night, Ray interviewed an Inuit hunter by the light of a seal oil lamp. The hunter described the starving, ghost-like white men he and his people encountered years ago, pointing south. As proof, he produced a silver fork with Captain Franklin's family crest on it. Inside the Inuit igloo at night, the hunter, with great reluctance, told Ray the final, terrible truth. He used gestures to describe the knife marks on the bones and the making food of one's companions. Ray's face, illuminated by the lamp, was a mask of dawning horror and profound sadness. Ray's official report was published in the Times newspaper office in London in 1854. The story of cannibalism caused a public uproar. The Victorian public reacted with outrage and disbelief, refusing to accept that their Royal Navy heroes resorted to such savagery. Charles Dickens even wrote articles attacking Ray. In Lady Jane's drawing room, a devastated Lady Jane read the report, her face pale. She refused to believe it, beginning a lifelong campaign to discredit Ray and preserve her husband's honorable reputation. In 1859, another searcher, Captain Leopold McClintock, funded by Lady Jane, found the stone cairn at Victory Point on King William Island. Inside, his men retrieved the metal cylinder containing Crozier's note. This was the first hard evidence. McClintock's party then discovered the skeletons and the abandoned boat on a sledge at Starvation Cove, just as the Inuit had described. The scene was a monument to despair, littered with the bones of the men who died there. A time-lapse montage showed 150-plus years passing, with quick, fading shots of the site being covered and uncovered by decades of snow. The relics slowly degraded, and the wooden boat splintered. The world moved on, and the ships were forgotten, a cold case. In the 1990s, a modern forensic anthropologist in a white lab coat examined one of the recovered skeletons under magnification in a modern research lab. A close-up on the knife marks confirmed the 19th century Inuit testimony beyond all doubt. Science had vindicated the oral history. In the modern research lab, scientists analyzed fragments of bone and hair using mass spectrometry. A technician looked at the results on a computer screen and told a colleague, "The lead levels are off the charts. The canned food was poisoning them from the very start." Then, in 2014, the search vessel of a modern archaeological team, Parks Canada's RV Investigator, was in Arctic waters. Inside, a technician stared intently at a sonar screen. A beep, an unmistakable ship-like shape emerged from the murky digital display. An archaeologist, Marc-André Bernier, stared at the screen, his face filled with disbelief and elation. He whispered, almost to himself, "We found it. It's one of the ships." It was a moment of profound historical discovery, the culmination of a 160-year search. An underwater shot showed the remotely operated vehicle, ROV, its lights cutting through the green gloom, gliding towards the sunken HMS Erebus. It rested upright on the seabed, perfectly preserved in the cold, dark water, a true ghost ship. The ROV's camera glided past a cannon, then pushed in close to the ship's bell, the name HMS Erebus, 1845, clearly visible under a thin layer of sea life. The camera moved towards the stern, towards the officers' cabins. It peered through a window into the dark, silt-filled interior of what was once Sir John Franklin's great cabin. 2 years later, in 2016, another search took place in Arctic waters. An Inuit ranger, Sammy Kogvik, on board the research vessel, told a story about a mast he saw sticking out of the ice years ago in a place called Terror Bay. They decided to search there, and the sonar pinged. The second ship was found. An underwater shot showed the ROV exploring HMS Terror. It was in even more pristine condition. Plates were still stacked nicely in the officers' mess. Glass panes were intact. Jars sat on shelves in a cabin, perhaps Dr. Goodsire's lost laboratory. Inside Captain Crozier's cabin, on the Terror, underwater, the ROV's light penetrated the darkness. A desk, a chair, shelves of books, everything coated in a fine layer of silt, but perfectly placed, as if he'd just stepped out to take a watch on deck. It was a profoundly haunting and beautiful image of a place untouched by time. A final sweeping aerial shot of the Arctic reveals the vast, beautiful, and deadly Arctic landscape. The sun glints off the water. We know that beneath the waves, the two ships rest silently, their stories finally being told. The mystery of the Franklin expedition is largely solved. The combination of lead poisoning from improperly sealed food, scurvy, starvation, and the brutal, unforgiving environment led to their tragic demise. But the human tragedy, the descent into desperation and savagery, remains eternal. The Franklin expedition stands as a cautionary tale of imperial hubris, the limits of human endurance, and the enduring power of nature. It also highlights the vital role of indigenous knowledge in understanding the Arctic, a knowledge sadly dismissed by the expedition's leaders. Though the ice consumed them, the discovery of the Erebus and Terror allows us to bear witness to their final moments, ensuring that the men of the Franklin expedition are no longer lost to the ice, but finally at peace, their story echoing through time.